Okay, calm down.
We did just celebrate some holidays, and I want to ask you about Jesus Christ. What's the deal? But a little bit about the historical Jesus Christ, who he was, what we know about him.
Yeah, so I did a lecture about the New Testament and the historical Jesus a few years ago, and it's something that I researched for a while. And I've wanted to learn about like the roots of religions, Judaism, Christianity. And the historical Jesus is something that comes up periodically as a subject of public interest. There's been a little flurry uh, over the past decade or so. And basically, at this point, I think you can pretty securely say there's a pretty firm consensus of scholars that we can say a few very basic facts about the historical Jesus and about who he was and what he did. And then outside of those, it's very uncertain, and many Christians have certain beliefs as a matter of faith, right, about Jesus and his miracles and the fact that he was divine. But just strictly historically speaking, what can we say? Really, there are really two core facts that pretty much any biblical scholar or Judaism scholar would agree on, which is he was baptized by John the Baptist and he was crucified. Those are things we can say pretty certainly. It's really not plausible that either of those things didn't happen. But then beyond that, well,
I'm
you
guessing
could
one was much more pleasant than the other.
hopefully one one would hope. But there we do know from other sources, from multiple sources, there was such a person as John the Baptist, and he led a sort of apocalyptic spiritual renewal movement during the King Herod period. And he brought people to the River Jordan and baptized them. And all our early sources about Jesus say this about him. It makes sense it would have happened. It also doesn't make sense that they would have said it if it wasn't true, because in a way it gives a certain precedence to John, right?
Right.
Before Jesus. So we're pretty sure that happened. And then the Romans routinely crucified people that they saw as political threats, right? Not just common criminals and not heretics. That was not their job to deal with religious heresy. But if they saw someone as undermining Roman authority, that crucifixion was the punishment. And again, the story that we see in just that basic fact, it makes sense. And again, many scholars have argued, I think persuasively, the early Christians wouldn't have said that if it wasn't true, right? It doesn't make sense to say, well, we had this Messiah who's a heroic leader who's going to redeem the Jews, and oh, by the way, he got crucified.
Right.
Like those
Kind
things.
of a downer.
Yeah, it's a downer. Not good for the image of your Messiah unless you reinterpret it in a spiritual way, right? Which is what eventually Christians did after many years. But beyond that, you can say, well, there's a very basic sort of outline of Jesus's life that probably is true, right? We can't be so certain, but it probably is true. He was a Jewish peasant who lived most of his life in the Galilee region in the northern end of Judea. He was baptized by John the Baptist. He preached. He had a spiritual message in some way similar to John the Baptist. He gathered a group of followers. He went at some point to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover, which was a common custom of Jews in that era. You'd go to Jerusalem to observe the Passover holiday. He caused some sort of disturbance that attracted the attention of the Roman authorities. He was arrested and condemned and crucified, right? So that's a sort of basic little snippet biography where we can say it's pretty likely that those things really happened. Then there are many other things, of course, about utterances that he said, miracles that he's said to have performed, people he knew, his family members, his disciples, that are recounted in the gospel stories that might be true. Some of them seem more likely than others, but there's a lot of uncertainty, especially, for one thing, because all of the gospel accounts about Jesus were written at least 40 years after he had died, and most of them even longer after that. So you just they're not direct accounts from the person himself.
And he was illiterate, another thing that you said, right? In your lecture?
Yes, extremely likely he was illiterate. It would, and if you look at the early descriptions about him and his family, they say that he and his father were tekton, which is a broad, all the gospels are in Greek originally. And it's a Greek word that means like a craftsman or maybe a builder. And it was not common for someone of that background, of that class in the Roman age, to be literate. But it's possible maybe he did. There was an emphasis on learning Hebrew as part of Jewish religious observance, but most kind of common peasants still didn't do it. So very likely he was illiterate. Yeah.
Pontius Pilate, I learned from listening to your talk on this, they think he actually did exist, right? Because they found
Right.
a grave.
Well, an inscription on it's a monument inscription. It probably wasn't his grave, but it was a Roman monument in the Roman town of Caesarea, which is probably where Pontius Pilate, he was the Roman procurator, which was like a minor governor. And he probably spent most of his time in Caesarea, which was the Roman port on the sea, and occasionally went to Jerusalem if there was like a problem, which often there
Right.
was on Passover. If there was like unrest, signs of dissension, he might go to Jerusalem. But for many years, it was questioned and debated whether he was a real person. But then this Pilate stone was found in Caesarea, which made specific reference to a procurator named Pontius Pilate. And so that corroborates those Christian accounts. And if I remember right, I think there also have been other textual references that have been found in the years since then. I'd have to look that up to be certain. But the Pilate stone was a major discovery because it was a clear corroboration. This was a real person.
Any other myths stand out to you? I know that you do a lot of debunking of myths, but any important myths about Jesus?
Um,
I mean, I'm going to go out on a limb and
it's,
say I don't think the whole Mary pregnant by God thing was real, but I don't want to push you into that corner.
again, I respect everyone's religious beliefs. I'm not here to tell anyone not to believe what their faith teaches. But if you look at the earliest account that discusses who Jesus was or his life, it seems pretty certain that's the Gospel of Mark. Mark was written the earliest, maybe around AD 70, and then other Gospels were a decade or two later. And it's fascinating if you look at Mark, it's the shortest. And if you open it up to the beginning, it begins with Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist, right? That's the first thing they say. And it's totally consistent in all the accounts about Jesus. It does not say anything about the nativity. So the stories about Jesus's conception and birth, Mary, the three wise men, the Star of Bethlehem, none of that is in Mark. That comes in later in these other gospels, Matthew and Luke particularly. And we just don't know for certain where that came from. Was that an oral tradition that went back to the earlier years, to Jesus's lifetime? Was it invented or borrowed from somewhere else along the way? We don't know. But as historians, the general rule is, all other things being equal, the earliest written account is most likely to be most accurate, right? And that whole story about Jesus is about the virgin birth and about Mary being immaculately conceived. That comes a bit later. It's not as early as these stories in Mark, which begins with the baptism.
Shifting gears a little bit, let's talk about Hanukkah. What's the
Yeah,
deal?
we just missed Hanukkah. I would have said Chag Sameach if it had been a couple days earlier. We just missed it, but
Well, it's still
I,
Hanukkah. Hey, it's a
in our
miracle.
hearts.
If they burn for 8 days, we can say Happy Hanukkah today. Yeah.
Right. We're declaring a new Hanukkah miracle.
Yes. That it
But
extended one day.
did you have a good Hanukkah?
I did. I actually did. I had some. I made. We did a little latkes party, but I of course forgot. This is not even a joke. I forgot the menorah. So yeah. But I grew up celebrating Christmas also.
Yeah, me
Yeah.
too. Me too.
Yeah.
'Cause, my father's extended family is Catholic, and we do it all. We do it
Yeah.
all. We don't limit ourselves. But Yeah, Hanukkah, I mean, the basic story that you'll tend to hear, which is a fairly old story, is that it commemorates this miracle where the Jews were trying to rededicate the temple for worship. They only had enough oil for one day, but it miraculously burned for 8 days. Like, whoa. Which, it's an old story, but it does not go all the way back to the historical events where the holiday actually began. So it really is originally, it's two things. It's a combination of two things. It's a celebration of the oil harvest, right? Which, it's great. Oil, we love it. It's prosperity. You can fry things. That's why fried foods are traditional. And the other thing is it's a celebration of the Maccabee revolt, which successfully retook control of Jerusalem in the 200s BC from the Seleucid Persian Empire. So, okay, so like, what the heck is that about? It's on the one hand, it's a rebellion against this empire. On the other hand, it also was an internal Jewish conflict. It really was a Jewish civil war, and it was a war over whether Jews would basically assimilate into this Hellenistic Greek speaking empire or would maintain their traditional distinct laws and customs, like the Hebrew language, kosher food, the Sabbath, etc. So, so to sort of just lay the scene, basically, I'm sure you know some of this, but for centuries, Judea or Palestine was ruled by the Persian Empire, which happened to be a tolerant empire, as we would say in modern terms. They encouraged different nations and tribes around the empire to worship their own gods, to follow their own customs. And so partly for that reason, if you read the Hebrew Bible, there's great praise for the Persian Emperor Cyrus, who's seen as a heroic leader who encouraged Jews to return to Jerusalem, rebuild the temple, etc. But then the Persian Empire was overthrown by Alexander the Great, who, was Macedonian Greek, and he didn't last for very long. He died. The empire falls apart. And these Greek and Macedonian generals and governors sort of seize control of the different provinces of Alexander's empire. And this dynasty, the Seleucids, who are originally Greek, they take control of Persia and of Judea. So that's now part of their sort of new little empire. And they start this program of trying to Hellenize the empire. So they encourage people to adopt the Greek language, Greek dress, Greek diet. They want to have a sort of integrated, assimilated empire. And Jews basically have to decide what they think about this. And a lot of Jews embraced it. A lot of Jews, this was a way of being part of a bigger world, right? To speak the Greek language, to be able to travel out there and communicate with all these different peoples. And some of them they Hellenize. And the word in Greek is Hellenizo. They Hellenize. They take on Greek customs. They wear togas. They eat pork, right? Things like this. And others do the opposite. They react against that and they Judaize or Judaizo, which is they take on distinctively Jewish customs and try to draw a clear distinction. We're sort of hardcore Jews, not those Hellenized Jews, and they adhere to kosher diet, the Saturday Sabbath. And there comes to be a power struggle, right? A political power struggle, especially in Jerusalem, right? Because Jerusalem is the holy city of Judaism. It's also the regional capital where all these Greek ideas and influences are coming in. And this power struggle plays out a lot in the temple, among the temple priests. And for several years, there is actually a Jewish chief priest of the temple named Menelaus. So he has a Greek name, and he embraces Hellenism, right? And he actually is the one who reportedly, if this is true, and it might be true, he does things like slaughter pigs in the temple to intentionally desecrate it so that it becomes no longer usable for Jewish worship, right?
Awful. As a pig fan, I hate that.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of animal sacrifice at the temple at this time. That's part of the deal. But it's just a question of which animals. But you may sometimes hear the story that it was that terrible Emperor Antiochus who did that. but it probably really wasn't. It was these Hellenized Jews who were engaged in this tug of war over the future of Judaism and Judea. And the basically this led to uh, a split right through Jewish society. People took sides, and civil war broke out. And this guy Judah Maccabee sort of led the guerrilla armies in the countryside around Jerusalem that revolted and tried to overthrow these people that they saw as collaborators with the empire, right? And to try to defend the continuity of Judaism as they understood it. And it's interesting actually, this word Judaism, I actually saw a really wonderful series of lectures by this great scholar Daniel Boyarin, where he basically explained this word Judaism comes from the Greek Judaismo or Judaismos, which is technically a gerund. It means doing Jewish things, right? Or acting like a Jew, or you could even say Jewing, right? So Hellenismos is Greeking, Judaismos is Jewing. And that the first occurrence of that word is in the book of Maccabees, which was a series of chronicles about this Maccabee uprising, where they successfully rallied the sort of guerrilla bands from the countryside, invaded and retook control of Jerusalem, and reconsecrated the temple to Jewish worship. Right. So this was an incredible military victory. And it was a victory for, you could say, the sort of hardline Jewish party against the Hellenistic party. And they founded an independent Jewish kingdom that lasted for a few hundred years, for a few centuries, till the Romans showed up, or the Romans actually were invited in. But that's really where this festival came from. It was celebrating the sort of miraculous victory of this Maccabee party and the renewal of what they saw as traditional Jewish worship in Jerusalem. That's actually what it's about. And the menorah that we light is a mimicry of the menorahs that were in the temple